So, we're coming to the end of this conference, which has been a wonderful meeting of many old friends and also some inspiring and also disturbing discussions. I think that there's a sense right now, as Tim Judah says in his contribution, which is in the book, that it's no longer the Balkans that are at a crossroads. They've actually taken a fairly clear direction and strategic direction towards Europe and Brussels. But now it's everyone else who's at a crossroads, and how to deal with that situation. And another concern that I have is that the discussion reminds me very much of discussions that we've had 5 years ago and 7 years ago. And in fact, Vesela Cherneva and Ivan Krastev, when they led the Balkan Commission's deliberations in 2005, they articulated a narrative and prescriptions that really have withstood the test of time. We could take that report and implement it, or say this is the way forward today. But of course, this was not the intention. The intention was that we would be somewhere else by 2012. So I think hopefully we can, in this panel, think a little bit about why there is this stagnation, and particularly in Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Macedonia. And then in the context of the turmoil in Europe and the context of the stagnation in the Balkans, what are the prospects? How do we get to European integration, as it still is the guiding principle? And this is a wonderful panel consisting of people who've thought about these things for many, many years, long and hard, some at the heart of the policy making in the capitals of the Balkans, some struggling with EU, or watching the struggle over EU reform nearby, and others in key policy positions within the European Union institutions. So I thought we could start from the heart, from Belgrade, and hear from Milica. Where do you think things stand today, and given the political context also in Serbia?
Thanks, Mina. It's for me a great honor to be speaker at the panel, and I'd say from the heart, from the region, not from any capital in the region, but from the region. I was thinking how to start, and I said, well, if we were look back 12 years ago at the Zagreb EU Western Balkan Summit in November 2000, we could see that we made a lot of progress since then, both in terms of regional cooperation and in terms of progress of countries of the region towards the European Union. You have one country from the Western Balkan, Croatia, which is soon to become a full member of the European Union. You have Montenegro hoping to open accession talks soon. You have two candidates, Serbia and Macedonia. You have Bosnia and Albania implementing their SAAs. As far as the regional cooperation is concerned, you have a better political cooperation and a much more lively and intensive sectoral cooperation. So from this point of view, both the countries in the region and the EU can be proud of this achievement. But on the other hand, there are still things which make you wonder. The speed with which some of the countries are moving towards the EU is painstakingly slow, and there are some persistent issues in regional cooperation. The question which this opens is, how do we apportion the blame for this? And what are these issues? First, the speed with which some countries are moving towards the European Union. Macedonia is a candidate for a very long time. Serbia took a long while to become one. Albania is, for 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, waiting to get the status, and Bosnia is waiting to apply. In the region, what are the regional issues? I usually compare it to the divorce. And when you divorce, you basically have property and children. What we have in the region is the dissolution of what was the common state. So you have property, people, borders, issues from the past, that sort of reconciliation, crimes. Where does the blame for this lies? Why is this 12 years on? Why is this not resolved? Is it the failure of the regional elites or the failure of the EU integration process? Probably it's not very wise if you say, well, there are some responsibility on both sides. The first thing that I would like to mention is that these issues, the remaining issues in the region, which are relevant for both the success of the EU integration process and for the regional cooperation process, are identity issues which are extraordinarily difficult to deal with in the beginning. And the second thing is that we are dealing with these issues against the background of a difficult economic crisis which is hitting the region, making delivery in terms of everyday lives of the citizens for the regional elite more difficult, and also making the environment within which the EU is functioning more difficult. It's not that the EU is giving up the enlargement process, but it is happening against a tougher background than the enlargement process of 2004 and 2005. In Serbia, to narrow the analysis to the country where I come from, there was a lot of tough issues to deal with until now. To mention just a few, we started off as Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, became Serbia and Montenegro, then Serbia had to deal with facing the past, which somehow became exemplified with the need to cooperate with ICTY, had to deal with the issue of Kosovo. In this process, faced the murder of the first democratically elected Prime Minister, Zoran Đinđić. And much as I'm sometimes annoyed that we didn't move faster at times, and there were times where we could have moved much faster, I'm also very happy that we didn't take a turn for the wrong at any of these crossroads. And there were a number of crossroads. So this makes me proud. The other thing, at times, I could have hoped for a more responsiveness from the side of the international community, speaking mainly about the first government that we had after the democratic change, the Zoran Đinđić government, which, while the Prime Minister was alive, didn't get even the feasibility study for beginning of accession of negotiations on SA8, membership of the Council of Europe, and Partnership for Peace. All of these things happened sooner or later, but after he was assassinated. I've listened to the discussion which at some point centered around Serbia this morning, and not wanting to underestimate the difficulty and the significance of things that remain to be done, and it's a heavy load of things that remain to be done, I still think a lot has been done. And it's only natural that people from the European Union and from the outside world would want to emphasize what needs to be done, and us, having been involved in something, we want to emphasize, okay, but these are many things that we've managed to do. I've been in this process for a very long time. I think now it's nearly 10 years, and I've seen ups and downs really of the process. And I think what is really important is, on one hand, to find the balance between the two and to keep the perspective. Things are going to continue. There was a lot of talk of not delivering on some things. We had a political process in the country. We had elections. This is now over. We are waiting for the government to be formed. We have a newly elected president. Having this political process is never conducive to doing difficult things, but now all actors are in place, and it is important that all of them are involved, take their responsibility, and move forward, and I'm quite sure that there is a willingness to move forward. So what I would like to finish with is that I really believe that the future of the whole region is in the European Union, that the journey will end once the whole of the region is in the European Union. But don't underestimate the difficulty of the journey. It will be difficult within countries of the region, not only because of the difficulty of challenge, but also because things are more difficult because of the crisis. People want to see delivery in terms of their lives. If accession talks are to start, they are still going to ask, okay, but what does this mean in terms of my employment? What does this mean in terms of my salary? You could say it could be much worse without it, but selling the counterfactual is never a great political sell. So it's not going to be an easy journey. And the EU is always eager to tell us that it's not going to be a short journey, which I think by now we all understand. But what is important is to keep the perspective and to also understand that all of us need success in this process. Region, which is an enclave within the European Union, can be a success of the European Union, and I think both of us at this moment need some successes. So I'm quite sure we'll continue, all of the region will continue. I'm not overemphasizing what was done, but still what was done, I think, is a promise of more to come in all of the countries in the region. Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? You say that there's a load that needs to be done, and of course part of it is the very deep governance problems, and not only in Serbia but in the other countries also that haven't yet gotten onto this path of EU integration. And it's the lack of rotation of political power in elections, although now you've had a recent rotation. It's in many cases a state capture by power brokers, less and less independent media voices, etc. Are those things that can be, I mean, how can those things be solved, and are they a side product of the European integration process that they become solved, or is there a momentum to work on?
I think it's probably a question to what extent things that you want the European integration process to produce, to what extent these are measurable things. In Serbia, we had quite a lot of political change. And even though sometimes you said, okay, these people were dealing with challenges better, and these people, on them we expected more, and these people were not really dealing with this how we expected. But we had some change. We had corrective in terms of people voting in the elections. And I think this also delivers in terms of other political processes, fighting corruption, answering other things. So I know how the progress report looks like and what are the things that the Commission looks at. But ultimately, there is also something you want to see, some processes which cannot be measured in concrete indicators. You know, some progress, moderate progress, no progress, which is usually what the Commission says. And some things are going to be hostage by the crisis, like the media, and it's going to be more difficult. But the continuation of the process, I think, is a guarantee of continuation of the change, even though sometimes we would all like to see a more livelier dynamics EU of change within countries, us in the region of the European integration.
Thank you. Sinan, you come from the context of Turkey having taken 2 steps forward, sometimes 1 step back, sometimes moving along. How does it look to you from that perspective, what's happening in the Balkans?
Thank you. What I'll try to do today, given that this is the last session, I'll try to be provocative while at the same time being lighthearted. So I want to tell you a story with 3 acts. The first act is entitled The Museum of Innocence. Now, for some of you, this is the title that you might know. This is the title of the Turkish Nobel winner Orhan Pamuk, where he tells the story, ultimately tragic love story, about a 30-year-old Turkish man, Kemal, who falls in love with an 18-year-old woman. And it's the story about how he gets fixated about this love. And the more he enters this relationship, the more he tries to deepen this relationship. He looks at different ways. He starts by collecting different objects, sometimes stealing them, and so on. But in essence, it's about the loss of innocence. At the start of the story, both of these characters are very innocent about how real love works. And eventually, at the end, you find out, after all of these developments, that it is really a story not only about love, but it's about the loss of innocence. And I think the EU today is also at this point, about the loss of innocence in what it has accomplished and also in what it can accomplish. It believed for a long while that it could, for instance, have a single monetary policy without having a convergent fiscal policy. It also believed that it could walk towards a quote-unquote ever closer union without having a political union. And I think today we are taking stock of that phenomenon. That's what I mean by the loss of innocence in the EU matters. But what is even more relevant for us is how this loss of innocence will affect the enlargement process. Because obviously it will. We heard Minister Mladenov at the opening session saying that when the foreign ministers meet, inevitably the discussions are steered towards the economic crisis. Well, that's to some extent unavoidable, because even if you don't talk about the economic crisis per se, you have to look at what the implications of that economic crisis will be and are, in essence, for the enlargement process. The enlargement, the whole methodology of enlargement is based on the assumption of the former EU model. Namely, there's a set of acquis that candidate countries are expected to adopt. But again, it's inevitable, and we already had the discussion about multi-tier Europe, that Europe will change. One of the conditions for acceding countries, for instance, was for them to join the euro. Now, is that, just to give an example, is that going to remain a condition for future candidates? So the way that Europe itself will change will certainly affect the way that the accession negotiations will be carried out. And I think this is certainly a factor that we have to bear in mind. Minister Bildt was saying that we should forget about the politics of the past and concentrate on the economics of the future. That, I think, summarizes very well where the accession negotiations, the way that the accession negotiations will also take shape. My second act is called 10 Years of Solitude. And here I want to pay tribute not only to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but also Dusan Reilic, who's sitting there at the third row, who wrote a very insightful piece, and I completely agree with them. The reason why I agree with them is that, in essence, past enlargements were characterized by what I call an ex-ante aggregation of political will. Now, what I mean by that is that when the EU decided to open the accession negotiations, its political will about enlargement had already crystallized. And from there onwards, it was really up to the candidate countries. The pace of the negotiations was dictated by the ability of the candidate country to fulfill EU membership requirements, to adopt the acquis. Remember the regatta principle. That was very instrumental in shaping the pace of the negotiations. Now, going forward, I will argue that this whole dynamic will change. The pace of negotiations will not be dictated anymore by the ability or the capacity of the candidate countries to adopt the acquis. They will be determined by the political environment within Europe. When that political environment turns acceptable, when public opinions become more at ease with enlargement, that is when the next wave of enlargement will happen. And therefore, we may look, actually looking ahead, at a period of at least 10 years. And those 10 years, that period, will not be affected by the capacity of the candidate countries to adopt the acquis. It is a function of whether European public opinions, the European political environment will be conducive to enlargement. Now, what that means, and for instance, in the Turkish context, because we have lived this for the past few years, is that the candidate country's public opinion, the political leadership, must be ready to take up the challenge of a loss of momentum, possibly of a loss of enthusiasm related to the negotiations. In the Turkish case, for instance, this whole accession talk started in 1999 when Turkey was granted the candidate status. And as of 2000, the Commission started to issue its progress report, or its regular report. This year, it is going to issue its 13th progress report. And as you can imagine, when the first progress report or regular report was issued, this was a big item in Turkey. Everybody talked about it. That was when I was famous in Turkey. Everybody invited me to talk on television. Now nobody really invites me to talk about these issues because there's very little interest about the progress report. So when you start to hit double digits in terms of the progress reports, you know that you're in trouble. My last topic act is called My Best Friend's Wedding. And what I mean by that is that when we participate in discussions like this, we do get to hear quite often about how the economic crisis has really undermined the EU's ability as a soft power, how it has really given a negative image of the EU, populations asking about why we should join the EU that's having all these difficulties. But I think more importantly than that, there are some who argue that it has even eroded EU's moral authority. A club that hasn't been able to settle some of the core questions about its own social model, which is in crisis, and therefore makes it very difficult for that club of nations, a community, to export the values associated with it. Perhaps even more seriously, this is happening at a time where globally there is a challenge to liberal democracies. We see a very serious challenge in the form of illiberal democracies on the basis of the economic track record that they have been able to accumulate over the past years. But I will argue that despite all these difficulties, the EU as a pole of attractiveness is still very relevant and remains very strong. A few days ago, I was participating in Istanbul at the meetings of the World Economic Forum, where I sat on a panel with Amr Moussa, the formal presidential candidate for Egypt. And he said something very interesting. He said that if he had become president, he was going to launch a program to steer the political reforms in Egypt by asking Egypt to become a virtual EU member state. And that's from a lead candidate in the Egyptian domestic politics. So I think the flow of history will continue. It's unavoidable that the Western Balkans will become a member state of the EU. I think it's unstoppable. But the reason why I said my best friend's wedding is I think, again, from a Turkish perspective, even then we may look at this wedding that's happening between Europe and the Western Balkans and without having been fully wedded at the EU ourselves at that time. But that remains the topic of yet another discussion. Thank you.
Just a quick one. The EU accession process has spurred policy change in lots of places, including Turkey, also Croatia. Why do you think it hasn't spurred that same change yet in countries like Bosnia? What's the difference there?
Well, the main difference when we look at the experience of those two different camps or categories of nations is that both in Turkey and Croatia, it has been the EU accession process was sufficient to form a coalition among the political leadership, among the different segments of society that would be able to tackle the core problems of those nations. And that type of consensus has not emerged in Bosnia, even with the carrot of EU membership. And that, I think, is the real difference.
Miroslav, Mr. Minister, you've spent some considerable time in Bosnia, among other places, but also in many parts of this region. Where do you see things heading?
As a matter of fact, my today's visit to Sofia is the last leg of my trip that brought me to Montenegro the day before yesterday and Bosnia-Herzegovina yesterday, and this was yet another proof that the Balkans never stop surprising you, because I arrived in Montenegro and I expected to see a lot of positive energy, enthusiasm. It was basically 2 weeks after the Commission produced its report recommending opening of accession negotiations, 2 weeks after the NATO summit that was very clear about the next summit being an enlargement summit and Montenegro being the front runner. But what I discovered there instead was a fear among the political leaders that they might be prevented from opening the accession negotiations for reasons which might be difficult to define, which might be beyond their reach, and then, of course, about the impact that might have on the government, on the society. Bosnia-Herzegovina, when I was arriving there, I knew that they are in the middle of yet another political crisis, changing the government, and my international partners whom I saw first were of the opinion that we are going to face another year lost for the reforms and for European agenda. But after the meetings with basically all political leaders, I was leaving the country rather encouraged, because they know what they are doing. It looks like they have things under their control, also time-wise, and they are quite self-confident that this will speed up rather than slow down the processes. So it's never an analysis good enough to tell you about the situation in the region. And I think part of the answer to these questions could be produced in our discussion. We are supposed to speak about the way ahead, but we shall define where we are. So what's the point of departure? And I think we agree that the enlargement process in the Western Balkans has been a moderate success. There are indisputable successes and results, but at the same time I think it's clear that the overall results are not adequate to the effort invested. And why is it so? Well, I can offer my personal observations. I think that, well, obviously there are takes two to tango, and it takes two to the EU enlargement process. I think that on the EU side, you got a bit spoiled by the Central European countries and their total commitment to the process. And this led...
I was agreeing. Sorry, I couldn't stop myself.
I'm not watching my bag that's over here, but as I said, this is my personal view.
Yeah.
So it sometimes led the EU to overestimate the pulling factor, the attractiveness of this process, and to throw in some additional conditions which are different for different countries, believing that they are so motivated that they will easily accept it. But this did not happen. We ran into troubles, we slowed down the process, and also in some cases we lost the transparency of the process. And it was difficult then to withdraw from some of our conditions when we discovered that they simply don't work. We've also, lately, of course, we are busy with our own problems, with the crisis, with the Eurozone issues. So we are not renouncing enlargement policy, but of course there is much less politicians arriving in the region and telling that this is your future, we can't wait to get you in the family, in the club. There is much less opportunities for the leaders to speak out, and they are panicking. I mean, there are much more voices, pessimistic voices about the EU's future that you find in the region rather than in the European Union. They keep asking, what does it mean? Is the EU abandoning us? Is the process dead? So we shall, of course, be clear about saying no. You know what it takes, and you have your space, and you have to do your homework. The famous issue of enlargement fatigue is, of course, not the fatigue. I don't believe in that. It's partly an excuse for those who don't believe in enlargement. It's partly the reality and the reaction to the fact that we are busy with our own homework. But it's also, and I would dare to say, reaction to that means EU disappointment with the performance of the Western Balkan countries, which led to the drop in the enlargement enthusiasm on the side of the European Union. Now, we have to face the reality that for the countries of the Western Balkans, the EU integration is very important, but it's not the #1 priority. Because of the legacy of the war, they have to deal with other issues, national identity, borders, name of the country, whatever. These issues are more relevant for them. So they do believe in EU enlargement. They are not going to put this on top of in their deeds, in their actions. they are telling us how important it is politically to get them in the European Union, and we are telling them in response how important it is to fulfill technical criteria. And we are not able to find the right balance because it is a mixture. And it's for us to know what the proper mixture of the political and technical aspects is. And sometimes it looks like the partners from the region do want to join the European Union, but on their own rules rather than on ours. So the way ahead, the way forward from it is not so difficult. The rules are here, and the rules have worked. We have to respect we have to demand respect for our rules, and we have to respect our rules ourselves. It's absolutely clear, at least to me, that there is no better alternative than the EU enlargement, both for the region of the Western Balkans and for the European Union. But as I said, don't be tempted to change the rules. If we see that there are partners who are committed, then they deserve to be promoted in the process. Don't stop them artificially for reasons which have nothing to do with their performance. We are killing the EU idea. We are killing the pro-EU forces in those countries. I mean, we have accepted our commitments. We have to stand by our commitments when we see that the countries are delivering. Another important point, we have to respect our partners. They are partners. We sometimes tend, or we have tended many times in the past, to come to the region to teach them, as if we are different sort of people. We own the truth, and we are there to tell them what to do. And obviously, Bosnia-Herzegovina is the case in study here, and there are still people who believe that perfect solutions from outside is the way forward for the country. But fortunately, the country itself understands that it's their ownership, it's their responsibility. For me, the most positive thing in Bosnia-Herzegovina and last year is that it's the local politicians who are setting the agenda, who are driving the agenda. It takes long, it's painful, but it's their process, and this is very important. So avoid at any rate any temptation of political engineering into their processes. Another important thing, and mistake we make, it's about countries, it's not about their political leaders. We need to have the right insight, we need to work with all relevant political factors. We must not believe those leaders who are telling us, it's me and nobody else. Ignore the rest. We've seen this very recently in one important country of the region, that now we are facing the situation which was not so surprising after all. Our partners must know, and we must miss no opportunity to tell them that EU membership is not a gift. It's not something that the European Union owes them. It's something you deserve through reform. Because the EU enlargement, after all, should strengthen the European Union, not weaken, and make it more and not less efficient. This is really important. So it's not a moral obligation. It's a win-win process, but obviously it's based on meeting the criteria. So it's about reforms, as I said. It's about transforming the societies. It's about making the societies compatible with the EU standards at the end of the process, not at the beginning, obviously. But we tend to be lost in details, and I don't think we enough stress these basic facts. We need to see clear European vision. We need to see respect for EU values. We need to see respect for human rights, minority rights, but not in documents. I mean, the documents are there, but EU integration and the real life are not two separate issues. It's one. So every day, every process, every political decision must be measured whether it brings the country closer to the EU or further away, whether it speeds up or slows down the process. And this is the question we must ask. When are you changing the government? So is it going to be helpful for your EU integration, for your EU ambition, which is, as you say, the number one issue? Good neighborly relations, good regional cooperation. And here we've seen a visible progress. I mean, the regional cooperation today and 5 years ago is a different story. Everybody understands how important it is, but again, it's never enough to stress how important it is, because the best way how you can prove that you fit into the wider European family is to show that you fit into your neighborhood. Even though we speak about the EU enlargement and about European process, again, it's extremely important, very close cooperation with the United States. US is a stakeholder in this process. US does have a say, and it's so important that there is a clarity on our approaches, on our visions, on our strategy between the EU and the United States. And finally, what we need to stress in our communication with our partners is that if you are serious about your membership, no one prevents you from behaving as if you already were a member of the European Union, even now. And not only when you go to Brussels and talk to the European institutions, but also in the way you communicate with your neighbors in your region, in the way you vote in the United Nations, and so on. Because this is the best proof, and this is what has the best and most positive impact on the EU member states. So it's not so complicated. We have invented the rules, we just have to respect them, and we have to insist that, of course, they are fully respected by our partners.
Thanks. Could I just complicate it a little bit, though? Sure. Since you come from a government and you're from politics, and domestic politics is jobs, jobs, jobs. I know that you're a foreign affairs minister, but isn't there a danger here that the process that's been described is going to be in a very different context with a double crisis of the Eurozone crisis, but also the entire economic stagnation that we're seeing, particularly again in Bosnia, but also elsewhere. You know, the Serbian textile industry is not in any way competitive to Turkish textile industry. There's a lack of new enterprises. There's a lack of there's brain drain, huge unemployment, and will this construct be able to hold? Because some of these countries haven't yet even applied for membership, and so the process is going to take a very long time from now until conclusion.
Right, and of course this is a real problem that the leaders in the region know that they have to sacrifice now, and the results will be delivered much later, probably beyond their political lifespan. But that's why it's so important that we work with the societies, and we make people understand how important it is, and we will leave as little room as possible for political leaders to lie, basically, about their commitment to the European Union. On the EU side, it takes a vision. We cannot move the process forward without a vision. Yes, we have a crisis. We all have our local elections, parliamentary elections, but enlargement is not a charity exercise. It's good for the European Union. The previous enlargements prove that they are good for the European Union as much as they are good for the new member states. So we must never forget that what we are doing is we are doing for the European Union, for the European continent, and it's also economically good. We need leaders with vision, and we need to remind them that the responsibility also on the EU side is wider than to get through the next local elections.
Great. Robert, the EU itself, where does the thinking stand? Why do the Balkans even matter anymore?
Well, if they mattered enough to send large numbers of troops there in the 1990s, then they matter. The justification for military action ought to be a long-term commitment. And they matter because they're a part of Europe. The emotional response to the wars in the Balkans was actually horror that this could take place in Europe. So it's not just, it's not a calculation, this is a part of Europe. I was involved, at least I was in UK at the time, in UK policy, when we decided in the late 90s that our policy was Europeanization and that the only solution in the Balkans was to make this a part of Europe. In the late 90s, then, as Milica has said, there was the Zagreb summit, there was the Thessaloniki summit, where this became policy, and this is policy, and this will remain policy until it's finished. And the European Union is not the most exciting, agile organization in the world, but when it's set on a course, it grinds its way remorselessly forward, and we will carry on until this is finished. Why? Well, we may have forgotten by the time we finish, but the answer is that's our policy, and that's what it's going to be, and this is a part of Europe, and there's no doubt about it. In with that, and I think I agreed with everything that, well, I know I agreed with everything that Miro said. in with that, of course, we talk about conditionality, and actually I don't like conditionality. I'm skeptical about conditionality. You never really get people to do things they don't want to do. Sometimes they trick you for a while, and so conditionality is somehow the wrong term. It's what Miro said. People have to be right to join the European Union, and therefore, in a way, I don't like the process. I wish we could do the process some other way. It would actually be better if everybody, if those who want to join, came to the European Union themselves, worked out what was needed, and did it themselves, rather than us kind of lecturing and forcing and writing reports. And then maybe people would work on the basis not of how little can we do, but how much can we do. And maybe the result would be better. But there I wanted to pick up and develop something that Sinan was saying. The euro crisis does make a difference. It doesn't make a difference in terms of any change in our commitment. It doesn't make a difference in terms of our ability to take the process forward, because we're a big machine and we can do more than one thing at a time. And we completed negotiations with Croatia. The crisis was already well underway by then. But it does make a difference to two or three things. One, I think that it's going to make a difference, I hope profoundly, that it's going to make a difference to the way at which we look at ourselves. And it's not the result, and one or two people have made this point before, it's not the case that when somebody is in the European Union, they're perfect. We've discovered that at rather a great cost now, and Greece is not the only case. There are other cases that are quite serious in the political field as well as in the economic field. And we ought now in the European Union to think about how we deal with that. Conditionality ought not to stop when you join the European Union. Conditionality is the wrong word, but let's say standards ought not to stop when you join the European Union. We need to have some way of revisiting whether we're all living up to the commitments that we made. So I think we ought to be tougher on ourselves, but it means also that we're going to be tougher on people who join, and we're going to want to know that they really mean it, and that it's not just for the sake of form, because we made mistakes in terms of being too soft. So I think it does get tougher. The third reason why it's going to get tougher, everybody knows it's going to get tougher, so I'm sorry for going on about this, but the third reason why it's going to get tougher is that as the numbers get larger, it becomes more important that you have a real sense of community. And therefore, what we need are people who don't negotiate on the basis that it's them and us, but on the basis that it's us. And that the question is not how much you can get away with, the question is how can we become a good member of us. If I keep losing count of the number of countries in this region, but it must be something like seven who are, now that's not as big as the quantitative and qualitative leap that took forward with the big enlargement in 2000 and whenever it was, four. Anyway, it's not as big a jump as that, but every increase in the numbers makes the negotiating process more complicated. And therefore, there's an unwritten criteria, which is that we need people who negotiate in a way that's going to work within the European Union. If everybody negotiates as though it's a zero-sum game, that cannot be done at 38. The place will fall apart. I just maybe say two other things. One is, well, when should all this be done? I know that it's difficult, but what's the point of doing it if it's not difficult? And there are lots of difficult things which, when you do them, turn out to be a lot less difficult than when you sit around thinking about doing them. And maybe they'll destroy you politically, but so what? Lyndon Johnson destroyed himself and destroyed the Democratic Party by producing reforms that have allowed President Obama to become president, that produced the only decent social reform. It was particularly that, because he destroyed the Democrats in the South in the end. But there we are. I think he's maybe the greatest post-war president, in spite of Vietnam and everything. If you're in politics, what else are you in it for, except to do things, rather than to worry about this is difficult and this is going to destroy me. So the only way to do things is to do them. And actually, I quote one of Lyndon Johnson's administration, the Secretary of Defense, McNamara. I heard him on the radio a little while back, and he was saying, someone was asking him about Iraq, and he was saying, well, I think we should withdraw. And the interviewer said, well, tell us more. When do you think, under what conditions do you think we should withdraw? And he said, well, I think we should withdraw under whatever the conditions are now. And that, I think, is the answer. Whatever it is you have to do, what's wrong with now? Look, we've been here for 30 minutes and nothing's happened. Why hasn't somebody done something? This is the only way that things only... I looked at the title of this session, which is something like The Path Forward, or something like that. Well,
way ahead.
Well, then I'm going to say The Path Forward, because there's a line from a Spanish poet, maybe Machado, which I like very much. The path is made by walking. And that's it. It's made by walking, not by talking.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more, though, about...
I was going to stop there and wait until somebody got out and did it.
Any volunteers? In any case, I will still, as a rejoinder, while people are deciding what to do, is what to do about the outstanding peace and conflict issues. Milica was very eloquent about the way that Serbia actually has been able to take one challenge after another, but it still has a few challenges to go. And so, you know, there's the Serbian and Kosovo contest over northern Kosovo. There's the Bosnian entities are in constant discussion about separation, referendums, and other things. Macedonia and Greece continue to talk about the name issue. There's still many, many outstanding questions. And
these
again,
are all things which, in a few years, people will look back and think how ridiculous this was. All of them. It's just a matter of doing them. Once you've done them, it turns out to be, well, either it turns out to be very easy, or it destroys you politically, or something of the kind. But nevertheless, when you look back, people will say, why did we waste so much time on this? And looking around, the Berlin Wall has come down, apartheid has come to an end, China has become a capitalist country. All of these things can happen. Why is it that things like, to mention another happy subject, the Cyprus dispute is still unresolved? It's ridiculous. That's not a complete answer. I will say that in the last session, the opinion poll showed that the two places where people were worried about future conflict, the youth, were Serbia and Macedonia. And I thought maybe that was right. Maybe there is something to worry about. I personally worry about northern Kosovo. I think there is really unfinished business to be done there, where there are real risks, primarily risks for the Serb population, and that really something needs to be done there seriously. And that's not just a question which is confined to that particular area as well.
Your exhortation to go out and just do something makes me think of a story that Ed Llewellyn likes to tell about a Wilton Park conference that happened in November 1989, where it was young British and German leaders coming together, and everyone was wringing their hands about how, you know, unification would not happen for another many decades, and then they all heard the news that the Berlin Wall was coming down, and all got onto airplanes and went to. So I'm wondering what might be happening out there while we're wringing our hands about the Balkans. But anyway, questions, Dimo. We'll take a few at the same time. So here at the front, and then there's a couple on this aisle.
I've got two questions. The first one is about the crisis. I mean, whatever comes out of it, there will be a new architecture of Europe, and there will be the multi-speed scenario. We already see it. So the question is that a blessing or a curse for the region? Some people say it's a good thing because it will make it easier to absorb new members in the outer speed or outer circle. But if you think about it, isn't the outer circle also kind of predicament, because it doesn't mean much convergence, it means being the way you are, trading with the EU, but not really changing. So if I throw it back to you, is it something that we should be cheerful about, this much more differentiated Europe? And the second question is about Turkey, really. Of course, Turkey and the EU have very much the same agenda in the Western Balkans, but isn't it the case that the kind of Turkey we get now also presents a rival model, that you can be outside the European Union, you can go strong and you can be self-confident? Of course, it's a delusion. I mean, Macedonia, Albania cannot do the same gig, but it's out there as a model and as an authoritarian temptation or kind of self-sufficient dream you can sell to do your authoritarian politics. So isn't it the case that now Turkey is becoming part of the problem in the Western Balkans with this self-confident image it projects?
Great. There was, yes, go ahead, please.
Two questions for Mr. Cooper from Malinka Danova, Macedonia European Policy Institute. The first one is on strategy, having into consideration everything that we heard, and the strategy of 2005-6 of 3 4 Cs, conditionality, consolidation of commitments, communication, and the new conditions and all the alternatives that were offered. Is there any thought of a new strategy or remodeling or reshaping this strategy for the Western Balkans, especially that that strategy was designed for 2014? Second question, you noted on the results of the survey and said that you understood why Serbian youth had the fears, but you didn't mention anything about Macedonia. Just to remind you, in 2003, this was the biggest success of the European foreign and security policy, and now it feels a bit abandoned. A comment on this, please.
Can you maybe hand over the mic to across the aisle?
Thanks a lot. I'm from the German Institute for International Affairs and Security, Dusan Reljic. Sinan Ulgen, without challenging you to come up with another quote from the movies or from literature, nevertheless, I'd like to ask you about the EU's relevance or lack of relevance for Turkey. If we listen to Foreign Minister Davutoglu, he's saying that it would be a nice idea if his country could join the EU by 2023, which is 100 years since the Kemalist revolution. But he doesn't sound so convincing any longer. And at the same time, we see that Turkey is working hard on establishing a leading geopolitical role in a mega area between the Maghreb and the Mongolian border. So has the EU become simply too small for Turkey?
Let's take 2 more before allowing a first round of responses. Christoph was over there on that aisle, and then there was over here, there was Ivan, sorry.
Thank you. Christoph Bender, European Stability Initiative. I have a short question for Milica Delevic and for Minister Miroslav Lajčák. When Montenegro would be, at the end of the month, be allowed to start negotiations in early July, what do you think the effect would be on Serbia's reformers? Would it be an encouraging signal, like it has been for the Slovak, Lithuanian, Latvian reformers when in '98 their neighbors, the Czech Republic and Estonia, were allowed to start negotiations, an encouraging signal to catch up, which eventually all these countries did?
So the last one from Ivan before we...
Thank you very much. I want to continue on this challenge of the ridiculous. So I want to go back to my Albanian story. And my story is the following. We know what you are doing with the countries when they are not progressing. You're not rewarding them. But what we are doing with a country which basically started to deteriorate. when you're losing a basic political consensus. Till now, the idea was that we have such a big carrot that it's as big as a stick. But you cannot eat the carrot all the time. And for me, the basic problem is what we're doing there. Having fair elections, which are not contested, in my view, is the institutional preconditions for everything happening. How the European Union is going to react? I'm asking because both Miroslav and probably Robert Cooper have been involved. For me, it's interesting in such a ridiculous situation like this, what the European Union should do.
Great. Well, who wants to start? I think few of them were directed towards you, Sinan, so do you want to...
Sure, I'll start. And despite Dushan's hesitations, I think listening to the questions, I think I should have gone on with the fourth act, potentially to be entitled The Empire Strikes Back. Now, Dimo, when you talked about Turkey's role in the Balkans, although I've been critical of the government's foreign policy on many accounts, I think on the Balkans, Turkey does not come across as espousing a different sort of future path for the countries in the Balkans. In many ways, what Turkey is trying to do in the Balkans is complementary to the EU's efforts. Obviously, the rapprochement between Serbia and Bosnia can be given as an example, the role that the country is trying to play in Macedonia as well. There is more of an economic rivalry that I will accept, but I think at the political level, Turkey's involvement in the Balkans is not in a way to destabilize the EU accession path of those countries. On the contrary, both at the rhetorical level and in practice, Turkey tends to support this process. On whether the EU is becoming irrelevant for Turkey, there would be some of my colleagues, and I think you heard one of them this morning, who may claim that the EU has outlived its usefulness for Turkey. In the sense that the initial spurt of reforms, the momentum for reforms, was certainly fueled by a desire for EU accession. It has enabled the type of internal consensus to emerge. But now we find ourselves at a point where the Turkish government does not necessarily need the EU card. And therefore there has been a loss of enthusiasm for the EU, and it is not coincidental that the democratic standards of Turkey are, perhaps euphemistically speaking, are in the backslide. Now that's on the domestic side. On the foreign policy side as well, there has been a desire over the past few years to reshape the foreign policy vision of the country. To turn it into a regional power, almost to seek what some call strategic autonomy. And that as a vision is not compatible with a vision of Turkey that will find itself fully embedded in the EU membership down the road. And there is a clash. Now, Turkey has been trying to find out about the limits of its own influence, somewhat by trial and error, and I think in many ways the overconfidence that was brought in by the economic success has taken its toll on Turkish foreign policy. So I hope that in years ahead there will be a reassessment, and there are still a substantial, although minority, in Turkey that believes that EU accession is a good thing. The latest figure that I have is 40%, and that is to be contrasted with the 74% support in 2004, when the decision to start the accession negotiations were taken. There is still a sizable minority for EU accession. But when you combine the tarnished image of the EU in Turkey and the fact, I think, somewhat erroneously, that we're doing fine as is, we don't need the EU when we're having 8% growth, when our regional influence is on the increase, that sort of assessment will have to be reevaluated. And we already see strains to this type of mentality in terms of countries' own influence in our near neighborhood, whether it's Syria, Iran, or Iraq. So I think the time for that reassessment is coming.
Milica, do you want to pick up?
What Christoph asked for, what the effect would be if Montenegro starts accession talks on Serbia and possibly other Macedonia as another candidate. I think whenever a country from the region makes a step ahead, I think it's a good thing for the region and therefore for Serbia and every other country in the region. Demonstrates that it's possible, it's peer pressure, and you try harder. Also, I think the Commission is trying hard to find ways to involve us, like inviting us for explanatory screening and sort of making us feel it matters to us in a way too. But I think ultimately what will be a game changer for the enlargement process is a bigger group of countries negotiating. It will change the leverage of the DG enlargement vis-à-vis the Commission and the region, and it would change the perceptions in the region, and ultimately this would change things because, you know, explaining explanatory screening, enhanced permanent dialogues is not an easy thing, and people don't feel it's something that consumes and changes the society really.
Do you want to come in on either Miroslav or Robert?
I can start with the first question about the crisis being the blessing or curse. I would say neither of it. It's a reality. It's a reality. It doesn't change the rules of the game. It makes it more difficult for both parties, but it's a reality. So we all have to face the crisis from our own angle, and the countries who are part of the enlargement process have to cope with it as well. But EU is serious and solid enough not to use this as an excuse for stopping the process. So just let's face it and let's deal with it. Is there a need for a new strategy for the Western Balkans? All I was trying to say is that there is no need for a new strategy. There is a need for clarity. There is a need for mutual respect for rules, and I don't think there is a better strategy. The strategy proved to be the best strategy possible. Isn't Macedonia forgotten? Macedonia is definitely not forgotten. It's very, very much and very often subject of our discussions. But I would dare to say that Macedonia is losing friends. And this makes it more difficult for Macedonia to succeed. You do need to have friends, and you gain friends by your work, and by making your friends believing in that you are sincere, you are committed. And one example, of course, is the famous name issue. Whenever the deal will be reached, you will have to go for referendum. But the communication from the political leaders to the population of Macedonia shows that they don't want this referendum to succeed, because this is not the message they are saying. So it looks like Macedonia is quite comfortable with the current status quo. Or at least it's difficult to convince the friends and partners that this is not the case. On Montenegro's effect on Serbia, I fully agree with Milica. We know how much the countries of the region watch each other. We know what was the effect of the visa liberalization exercise on some countries, and how it triggered. It was only then that it started the process in Bosnia and Herzegovina, when they realized that it's real, and the other countries of the region did get the visa-free access to countries of the European Union. So it certainly will work. And to Ivan's question about what we do with countries that go back would be good. I mean, EU is too positive and too solid. EU philosophy of enlargement simply does not count on the approaches that we unfortunately are witnessing, that the countries they stop delivering or even start rolling back. I think it would be good to demonstrate that we are acting according to the more for more, less for less, and nothing for nothing principle. Last year, when we had crisis in Albania, there were informal discussions about suspending the IPA funds A couple of MEPs mentioned publicly the possibility of suspending the visa-free regime for Albanians, and that made the political leaders really scared. Really scared. But the fact is that it would be difficult to implement because EU is positive by definition. It would be difficult to get a consensus on negative measures because the whole enlargement process is based on the presumption that the countries are candid and they do want to progress towards membership, and therefore they do positive things even if they struggle. So it would be much, much better for the process if EU doesn't have to think about the way backwards, and I do hope that we will not find ourselves in a similar situation again. So that's from me.
Robert.
But Ivan's question was a good question, and we ought to think a bit more about it. And I was going through the images of taking the carrot and forcing it down people's throat and wondering what that meant. Let me say two things in answer to the questions generally. First of all, it's not, in a way I undersold the commitment to enlargement when I spoke at the beginning. It's not that we made a commitment X years ago and that it's still valid and we're still carrying on. Actually, it's not a solid majority for enlargement in the Council. There is unanimity for enlargement in the Council. This remains the case, in spite of everything that you hear. And I hope that we'll see that in the case of Montenegro soon. The second thing the second question I wanted to answer was the one about the crisis and the impact of that in the European Union in creating maybe a second circle. This is something actually that worries me profoundly because I'm British and I know where the UK is going to be if that's the case. And I don't like the idea very much because there seems to me a risk that the second circle may be a second-class circle and may include a bunch of second-rate countries. And I don't think that's desirable for anybody. I don't think it's desirable to have enlargement on those terms either. So I don't know what the answer to this question is, because clearly I believe, like whoever it was, that I believe that the Eurozone is going to require a higher degree of integration to make it work. And I also don't believe that everybody can and should join the Euro as it is now. I do believe, on the other hand, that the Euro is the responsibility of every member of the European Union. And we all voted for the treaty with the mistaken assumptions and mistaken rules and lack of proper political authority behind the currency. Everyone is responsible for it then, everyone is responsible for it now. I have a slightly guilty conscience because I'm not going to answer the question on Macedonia because the lady who asked it was from Macedonia and she must know the answer much better than me.
Great. Well, I think there were a few more. There's one here which I didn't take on the last round, so, and then second one here. And anyone else? I see. Third one.
Okay, Jerzy Burma from Institute for Democracy and Mediation and Tirana. I have one brief question and a comment. As speaking about the role or Balkans way ahead in the globalized world, my question is for Mr. Cooper. Given the fact that the general feeling sometimes in different Western Balkan countries is that the EU's approach in the long run, let's say for a 10-year vision for the Balkans, is sometimes between an approach that it is between confused and or misplaced sometimes. Now, the EU is more or less successfully trying to be on the same page with the US policy in the Western Balkans. But in the meantime, and as some of the Western Balkan countries are quite enjoying the waiting room before entering the EU, there are also some, let's say, other options or developments that are taking place in the Balkans. Like some of the countries, as we already know, feel more, in certain ways, closer to the Russian approach. There are other countries that are kind of flirting with some, let's say, Chinese investments or investments coming from Islamic countries. We all know the fact that Turkey is doing quite well in the recent years to increase its influence in the Balkans. So my question is for Mr. Cooper: is the EU coordinating steps or adjusting its, let's say, 10-year vision for the Balkans, and how the EU's role should be in this regards, taking into consideration these elements? The comment was about what Sinan brought to our attention, quite an interesting point, actually, pace of accession. Sinan said accession negotiations will largely depend on the political environment in the EU, and this reminds me a lot of the story with the Swiss children arguing about how our baby is made, and everybody has its own opinion about it, and the fourth kid comes and says, "Don't generalize. It depends from. It's different from canton to canton." Thank you.
Erhan Türbedar, Tepav, Ankara. I have one question for Mr. Ülgen and for His Excellency Mr. Lajcak. During this forum, we had many times mentioned regional cooperation as one important element for the countries in the region. But in the last 3 years, definitely Turkey, Ankara and Brussels were not enough cooperating in the region. I was using every opportunity to push Western and Turkish diplomats to consider this cooperation more in the Balkans, with the argument that this will not just consolidate peace and democracy process in the Balkans, but that this will be a new beginning, or that there will be refresh relations with Ankara and Brussels also, but without results until recently. And my question is, what lies behind this? Is this reflection of general stagnation in relations between Ankara and Brussels, or are there specific elements for the Balkans? Thank you.
Did you have a microphone?
Thank you very much, Lazar Kekic from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Quick comment, really. There's been a lot of various negative comments about various issues at this conference, which I guess, given the state of the world, not surprising. But listening to some of the things were said today, it actually occurred to me that there is one, or at least one, very important positive message as well. It's about the state of democracy in the region, which, with unfortunate, as Ivan pointed out, there are exceptions, Albania, for example. But otherwise, in Western Balkans, this has to be a success story. I mean, we have various examples, despite the extraordinary difficult circumstances. Most recently, just to look at it and emphasize it again, Serbia, despite everything, you've had a free and fair election, non-violent, the loser congratulated the winner the next day. Unlike in the rest of Europe, there's no neo-fascist party in parliament. The radicals didn't get a representative. Turnout was over 60%. People are engaged. They care about democracy. So if we had any message from, certainly Arab Spring, and as we see even in the Western Balkans, I think that's quite a heartening one. And insofar as the other side of that coin is a certain disobedience to the wishes or the dictates of Brussels, so be it. So at a sort of different level, when we look at what's happening, and I would address the question to Mr. Cooper. He laments the fact that UK may be in the outer sphere, and in the not too distant future, it probably will even have a referendum on its EU membership. And certainly the vast majority of people in the UK, as we all know, are not going to accept the sort of political integration that saving the euro or even the EU might entail. Now, why do you lament that? That's the triumph of democracy over, if even necessary, the EU. Is that something to be lamented? Thank you very much.
Okay, are there one or two more to close the round of questions for this session? Please.
So My name is Alexandros Malias from Greece. As there was a lot of discussion also and drawing some parallels with between the changes in Europe that occurred more than 2 decades ago and developments in the Arab world, I would like to say if within the European wouldn't be wise, and the job is not over in our region, wouldn't be wise to try to devise as from now a kind of process going beyond some Mediterranean projects that were advanced from Europe, a kind of Euro-Mediterranean integration and cooperation process, which would be going to involve the long term all countries of Mediterranean, Israel included, on basis of criteria and sticks and carrots. Thank you.
Slobodan Đinović from Canvas, Serbia. So my question is related to the further negotiations on the member candidates for the EU. As from the Balkan region, most of the people were upset with their political elites because of the conflicts, accusing them of lots of, issues that have happened throughout the last 15, 20 years. So when the negotiations with Croatia happened and when the Croatia had to deal with the anti-corruption issues, I think that lots of people around the region were finding actually very encouraging and very stimulative, because that was one of the European standards that was about to be brought in the region. And in different kind of business forums, I think there is no single one that the corruption is not mentioned and one of the top 2 or 3 priorities to deal with. So my question for anybody, Mr. Lajčák Cooper, is like, is the EU about to keep up with the same standards throughout the next and future candidates who are about to negotiate their way towards the EU?
I saw one very last hand here.
Thank you. Thank you. Question for Mr. Cooper. You have been leading a dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo for almost a year and a half. The agreements have been reached. I heard you talking about North. No implementation is on the site. Certainly there are concrete things that happen after achieving the agreements. What that means for the region and what signal is the EU sending in terms of that. And for Mr. Lajčák, as a minister of Slovakia, to end the ambiguity of the non-recognition of independence of Kosovo and you presenting a EU institution at the same time. What does it mean also for you to kind of send the signal on the 2 policies that come to Pristina and the region altogether?
Great. So this will be one. I think we have to draw a line on the questions. So I'll give the panelists a chance to respond to those. I'd like to add one question. Sadly, Carl Bildt doesn't seem to be in the room anymore, but the Swedes like to. There's a saying that, is he there? No. If the plan and reality don't match, then follow the plan. Are we in that situation now with continuing to say, this is the strategy, it will hold whatever happens in its environment and surroundings? I mean, how realistic is that as a message, and is it credible to the publics? And I guess the other question I have is, stagnation seems, from what we're discussing, seems to actually be a pretty good outcome in the eye of the Eurozone storm. And is that the case? Can the Balkans afford a continued period of stagnation without some way of moving forward? So maybe we start in the reverse order now with Robert.
I don't know. I want to answer all the questions, and I'm trying to understand and remember them, but there were 1 or 2 that I felt a need to answer. Somebody said something about, it was over here, something about disappointment with elites. The good thing about, there's some story about if politicians saying, if the electorate gets rid of you, then get rid of the electorate, or something like that. Well, the good thing about elites is you can get new elites. If you don't like the elites, get new ones. And all of the people here are, I mean, to be honest, what disappoints me a little bit about civil society in the Balkans is that civil society in the sense of NGOs, not in the term that is that there are so many good people there. And why aren't they in the political parties, changing the system, rather than outside complaining about it? And that's the answer. Get new elites. get all the people that we've seen here. There's something to do. Second question, which is again kind of somebody talked about, well, wasn't it a good thing that people were defying the dictates of Brussels, and so what if the UK found itself in some squalid outer circle? Wasn't that the will of the British people? First of all, Brussels doesn't dictate. People choose. They choose if they want to join, and if they want to join, then I hope they choose the European standards. Those are not dictates. And secondly, the idea that serious questions should be settled by referenda is fundamentally a bad one. This is undemocratic. This gives people power without responsibility. In Britain, for years, people refused to have referenda on the death penalty because they knew what the result would be. Democracy is not just about voting. Democracy is about serious debate. When I say democracy, I mean parliamentary democracy. I don't mean having populist referenda campaigns. And I really dislike this. I think that it's anti-democratic. That's the problem with democracy. By the way, in the Balkans, it is true. Actually, not everywhere. There are some pretty awful cases still. But actually, the democratic record in the Balkans is not bad at all. And what we want to see next is we want to see the rule of law match that standard, because these things go together. Maybe it's about time I stopped. Have I been rude to enough people? Yeah, probably.
Miroslav.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with the observation about the state of EU-Turkey relationship and cooperation in the Balkans. It could be better, and it should be better. And why is not so? There are formal institutional reasons, namely that for a full-fledged standard cooperation you need consensus, which you don't have. And second, there are, I think, also psychological reasons. Simply, it would be quite difficult for Turkey to promote vigorously the EU enlargement and EU perspective in the Western Balkans and to look credible at the same time. That means the answer is to get out of the lockout in the EU-Turkey relationship in order to explore the potential for better cooperation in third countries on third issues, and the potential undoubtedly is here. I don't think we need the new processes or new formats. I do believe that what we have in the EU enlargement with our Mediterranean programs, with the Eastern Partnership programs, I do believe that these are the right answers to our outreach to the countries who want to be our members or are going to remain our neighbors. I almost started believing that this for once will be a discussion about the Western Balkans, and I will not be asked about the non-recognition, but I proved to be right or wrong, I don't know. Look, the Council conclusions from December speak about SAA feasibility study, about the launch of visa facilitation program for Kosovo, about the need for Kosovo to join the EBRD. These conclusions were adopted unanimously by 27 members. There is communication, there is cooperation. Slovakia hosted recently GLOBSEC conference. Many of you were there. Deputy Foreign Minister of Kosovo was there, was invited. So, I mean, don't look for answers, not for excuses. Slovakia has its office in Pristina, issuing visas into the documents of Kosovo. So, I mean, this is not the real problem. I feel very comfortable in my shoes, in whatever position, because I'm consistent with the position. I even paid a visit to Kosovo in my capacity as Foreign Minister of Slovakia during my first mandate. So let's look into the core of the problem, and the core of the problem lies within Kosovo, not outside of Kosovo. That's what I want to say. And none of the EU member states, recognized or non-recognizers, is questioning the need for Kosovo to be part of the regional cooperation and to be part of international financial institutions and to be part of all the processes that lead to improving the economic, social standards and regional cooperation. And finally, I very much like, and I have to say what Robert said, that Brussels dictate. It's the free will. You want to join the club. Probably we are making a mistake by stressing the need to fulfill conditions. It's rather meeting the standards. You've chosen, and conditions look like it's a bargain or negotiation with some, but it's about the standards you want to meet in order to be eligible. Our strategy, there is, again, I would repeat, there is no need to, our strategy is right, but we are not fully respecting it. So we don't need to create a new strategy. We should rather make sure that we use and exploit the existing strategy to its maximum capacity.
Can I just say
yeah,
one word
please.
more? Because I realized then, I was reminded there was a question I didn't answer, dialogue, results of the dialogue. It's not true to say that there was no implementation. There's been a lot of implementation. There are some important gaps, but a lot of it has been implemented. The important gaps, by the way, are on both sides. I just thought I forgot to say that.
Yeah, that's important.
Thank you. So, Sinan.
Yes, I want to answer the question on regional cooperation, and I am going to be slightly less diplomatic than Minister Lajčák. I can give you a number of reasons why it doesn't work fully. Those would be institutional reasons. But fundamentally, it goes back to what Robert Cooper said. And it is that we Turks view the EU as them, and the EU still views us as them. We don't view the EU as us, and the EU does not view us as us. And interestingly, when the negotiations started, we thought that we would see a positive cycle of confidence building. It had the exactly opposite perverse impact. It did not raise confidence. It decreased the confidence between the two sides. And fundamentally, as long as this gap of confidence exists between the two sides, there is going to be a natural limit to how much Turkey and the EU can cooperate in the area of foreign policy, whether it's the Balkans or the Middle East.
What I'm going to say relates to something Mr. Kekic raised. I was thinking about when we had the first round, the parliamentary elections and the first round of presidential elections in Serbia was 6th of May. On that day, there were elections in France and in Greece. And I was amazed to see that in the election campaign, the least EU bashing was actually in Serbia. And I think it holds true for the whole of the region. And I think this is a big asset for the EU on one hand. Don't lose it. And the other, an indicator that sometimes political courage is needed within the EU and not only outside.
Well, that's a very good note to conclude on. And I would just say that it would be foolhardy to try to summarize this session, but even less the whole conference. But I think that one thing that comes very clear is the sense that we have to, there is, at least in this room, a commitment to continue along the path that has been set. And I like this idea of negotiating as us rather than us versus them. I think that's a very important idea, that it is about all of us benefiting. And hopefully this can all result in some renewed energy to go out there like Robert was exhorting us, and let's go and just do it and not continue talking. So thank you very much, and please applaud the panelists.